1974, when they came, we had a very different reception to them. But now, in 2015, when you have the British here, when you have the best leaders that they sent to us, Miss Vicky Treadle, the High Commissioner of Britain, right here, you must say that we never walk alone. In the SDG, we work together with the best of developed nations, and because it's not in the jadwal, as we say it here, it's not in the list, but we are gracious hosts, and we would like to invite Honorable Vicky Treadle to give just a few words before she moves upstairs and inspire our young. Over to you, Honorable Vicky Treadle.
Before I go and join the youth group that is taking place here, the first thing I should say is that Britain is back in Malaysia in force, but in a new spirit of partnership with this country. Of course, Britain carries some colonial baggage with it, but that is definitely consigned to history. But when I was having conversations before, you know, one of the great legacies was the great institutions that were left behind here, not least democracy, the rule of law, and these things are very important in a modern age, to hold true to those values. So part of our work is to encourage our partner in Malaysia to hold true to those values. With the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed at UNGA just a couple of weeks ago, I'm deeply proud of the state of Perak, and indeed this particular initiative started by your Chief Minister, to hold a conference like this, to actually take a lead in Malaysia. And I'm doubly proud that it is the state of Perak and it is here in Ipoh that this is happening, being an Ipoh girl myself, having been born in this great state. So it is a huge pleasure that in my adult life to return as a senior British diplomat to represent that old colonial power, but in a new, modern and relevant way. And one of the things we've been discussing is how the British High Commission and I can support next year's event. And I can tell you now that there will be 3 themes that I would like to explore. I'm upping the ante. 3 themes that I would like to explore, and actually these are 3 themes that the British High Commission, in terms of our strategy going forward with our engagement with Malaysia. The first is youth engagement. The younger generations of Malaysians who are coming through, who by the next election, all those eligible to vote, if they choose to exercise that democratic right, 70% of potential voters are going to be under 30. So youth matters, because youth will shape the destiny of this country, and we will want to engage with the youth of Malaysia. Secondly, not in any order of priority, but of equal priority, women's empowerment. When you talk about sustainable and inclusive growth, it has to include the place of women. And women's rights as part of human rights is absolutely central to that agenda. You cannot have economic empowerment of women if their basic rights are denied. So the place of women in society and how women can play a leading role, not just in the family, but in business, in academia, and most importantly, in politics. Greater female representation across all segments of society. And underpinning all of that, our third theme is education. Education at every level. Without education, without knowledge, without skills, without the transfer of knowledge, sustainable and inclusive growth cannot be possible. So do the young people who are emerging have the right skills? Do they have employability? It's not just a question of degrees. Training, vocational and technical skills and vocational training are equally important as alternative routes in business and in industry. So youth, women and education. We will be back next year. We will be part of the wider program here at PIDD, but I wish you every success for what remains of this year's conference. Thank you very much indeed.
And we hope the few words will come with a few pounds, looking at the exchange rate. Dr. Mazlan will be smiling. But whatever it is, we will never walk alone in this topic. So I would like to start today to acknowledge our first speaker for Keynote 2. And this is a very, very distinguished speaker. At Astro Awani, we've been discussing about sustainability since Astro Awani began 8.5 years ago. We have featured more than 16 Nobel laureates on this topic. We have interviewed 4 Nobel laureates and professors of economics, but Dr. Michael Woolcock, the lead social development specialist in the World Bank's Development Research Center, is very, very amazing. If you only Google all his books and all his written articles, it's very clear that he is, to me, actually an Asian in a Caucasian body, because he has even relocated to Kuala Lumpur to further the research into knowledge and research hub for KL, for World Bank, to look at sociology and socio-economic issues. Of course, he has been to the best of the best unis. He has taught for 10 years at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He has co-authored over 60 journals, articles, also book chapters, 8 books under his belt on various aspects of international development. Justice for the Poor is only one of it. And even though he's from down under, but he got his master's and PhD in sociology from Brown University. And I particularly like a few articles on social cohesion and the role of public policy and policy at institutional level. And together with others, he's found out that the more we are divided, the less we are able to develop and let alone be inclusive. So without further ado, I would like to call Dr. Michael Woolcock, the lead social development specialist of the World Bank's Development Research Group, to come on stage and present his points. Please, a big round of applause.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is my first opportunity to speak in Malaysia, having resided here now for nearly 3 months. I'm part of the team of people that have come at the invitation of the government of Malaysia to help establish what we call a knowledge and research hub. It's the first of its kind anywhere in the world for the World Bank. And our agenda going forward will be both to disseminate knowledge about Malaysia's development experience around the world, to cultivate new knowledge that may be useful and relevant for Malaysia as it engages in its ongoing development work, but also to make Malaysia an epicenter for discussion and dialogue around the world about various different aspects of development. And so I'm really excited to be in Malaysia generally. I'm even more excited to be outside of KL, to be here in Pangkor, and to see such a vibrant and inclusive and broad discussion around development. We need much more deliberation and dialogue around some of the many key issues we face in development, and these kinds of forums and these kinds of topics are the kinds of topics that require deliberation and dialogue to solve them. Those, I will argue today, are very much the frontier issues for thinking about development in the 21st century. There are some issues, of course, that can and should be solved through various different technocratic, smart people type reforms, but most of the really hard challenges, as I will argue here today, require us to think much more deliberatively about the vast array of problems that we confront. So that's where we're going to go. Here's a brief roadmap for what we're going to talk about. I'm going to start off by giving you my sense of what the big picture is here. And I will just talk about development as a fourfold transformation, as a process of change that occurs in 4 different areas: in the economy, in society, in the polity, and in public administration. And we'll argue that economic growth is very necessary but very insufficient for driving all 4 of those different components. That's often not how we talk about development, at least in places like the Kennedy School and elsewhere where I frequent. But I think it's very much where we need to be talking about development here in Malaysia and in many other countries around the world. So the development as this 4-fold transformation, I will argue, has various different phases to it. When we start off talking about this, we usually want to be concerned about building stuff. We want to build roads, we want to build schools, we want to build hospitals. And those can be done, and for the most part certainly have been done here in Malaysia. Once we've done that, then we need to move into these slightly more complicated tasks of providing public services for all. Making sure that kids have schools to go to, making sure that they have health clinics that women giving birth can go to. Malaysia's done most of that too. The really hard challenges are, to use the author whose books have been out in the shelves here, Jim Collins, these good to great transitions, the final frontier of really taking countries to that full encompassing dimensions of development in all those 4, requires us to have high capability institutions for delivering, for implementing. And development can't be sustainable, I would argue. Development can't be inclusive, and development can't encompass all 4 of those different dimensions unless we have very effective institutions for implementing. And most of my talk today is going to look at this apparent paradox between a world in which most indicators seem to be improving. As has been mentioned, we've just had a big conference celebrating the end of the Millennium Development Goals and the transition to the Sustainable Development Goals. And many of the things that have been legitimately and rightly accomplished through the Millennium Development Goals now have to transition into a more difficult phase. And education, since the High Commissioner has already mentioned this, education is a really good example of that kind of transition. We've built schools, we've trained teachers, we've printed textbooks, we've provided the ingredients, we know how to do that kind of stuff. And the Millennium Development Goals, as articulated, were largely about getting kids to go to school, to enroll in school. The Sustainable Development Goal in education, you will note, is about learning. It's not just about putting children in schools, it's making sure that learning actually happens when they are there. And in that space, in the space of trying to improve the capability of institutions to provide for everyone, on that front, everybody has lots of work to do, rich countries, middle-income countries, and poor countries alike. So I'm going to then conclude by looking at what role I think evidence can play. I work in the research department of the World Bank, in particular the part of the bank that calculates and talks about the degrees of poverty in the world and inequality in the world. So whenever you read in the newspaper that a financial crisis has put 200 million people around the world back into poverty, says the World Bank, that's my particular group within the bank that is making those kinds of calculations, trying to do very precise estimates from an array of survey tools around the world. So this talk, by virtue of what I do, will tend to center on the role of research and on the role of evidence. But I want to try and use this opportunity here today to make a call for having a very different kind of approach to how we think about evidence in the policy process, and particularly on the implementation process, because I think that is really where a huge gain can be made, and indeed what is so central to improving the quality of our implementing systems is having reliable and accessible and freely available data to be able to help us engage with those questions. So that's the broad overview of where we're going to go for the next hour or so. So the big picture, I think, is about understanding development as transformations in 4 different dimensions. We have this well understood, I think, and at least agreed upon understanding that a key part of having a modern economy is having what Simon Kuznets called modern economic growth. And modern economic growth is growth that happens by adding value to your various different products and resources that you have inside your country. By being more efficient in the way that you produce things, you become richer. So that part of it is fairly well understood and agreed upon. And then in the more recent times, we've now started to focus more on the inclusivity of that growth process, making sure that inequality isn't high or too high, that everybody is brought along for the ride. So it's one particular component, though, of the development story, is having a modern, high productivity economy. What we also want to see, though, I think what also happens as a result of the development process is we have quite fundamental changes in the way that societies are governed. We have transformations in the polity, in the way in which preferences of the citizens aggregate into the kinds of leadership systems that we have. We don't necessarily have to have democracies as the West understands them, but I think a modern polity is a system in which the people in power reflect what the prevailing view of the citizens is. And that can happen in many different ways. There are many different kinds and varieties of democracy and more and varied different ways of aggregating the preferences of citizens into the prevailing political system. But that mechanism has to be forged, and that's a big transformation that has to occur, and it's usually very contentious because powerful people often don't want to give up the kinds of privileges that they enjoy. What also happens in the space of society is that there's quite fundamental transformations there as well. The Chief Minister mentioned one of those, in gender, for example. One of the things that happens as a society becomes more productive is that it needs to include more of its citizens in the production process. And it also requires and entails quite a fundamental value shift in the way in which different groups get along with each other, whether it's men and women or different ethnic groups, different religious groups. But creating a space wherein all of those different groups come to respect one another and come to hold each other as equals is, again, a very big social transformation. Again, as in the political system, one that has very often been fraught with lots of conflict and lots of contention. The final one, and this is the one I want to focus a bit on today, because it's a little bit boring, but I think it's actually really interesting and really important for making all the other things happen, is the modernization of the public administrative system, the public institutions that pave the roads, that build the schools, that regulate the companies, that generate the tax revenue. All of those things are very much part of what it takes to be a fully developed society. And creating public administrative systems that can do incrementally more complex and contentious tasks is, I think, the frontier issue for development in the 21st century. We haven't got very good ideas, really, about how to do that. We have lots of Nobel Prize winners around economic growth. We have lots of pressures and lots of interesting people thinking about how to make societies more democratic and more equal. But in the space of public administration, we think that's either too boring or we don't really know what to do about it, or we think it's too hard, so we don't touch it. But I think this question of how we build the capability of systems to deliver for everyone is the 21st century issue. If you can't do that, you have, in the worst case scenarios, you have what we call fragile states. You have states that literally can't provide even the most basic forms of security for their citizens. At the middle stages, you then have systems that can do relatively straightforward tasks, the logistical tasks, the technical tasks. But at the frontier, the issues, the space wherein a country goes from being good to great is where it figures out how to create high capability institutions to do incrementally more complex and more contentious tasks. That's my definition of that term. And I'm going to come back to talk a bit more about that as we go through. Now, the even bigger picture is to look at this over a 400-year process. Okay? And if we do that, we can cite an important book by Nobel Prize winner, Bob Fogel, looking at transformations in poverty and economic growth over a 400-year period. And by that 400-year period, he means roughly the year 1700 to the end of the 21st century. So if you look at that, and this is a stylized graph, you can see that for the most part, we, the world, have made huge progress in reducing the most absolute and widespread forms of poverty. Most people, for most of history, in most places, have lived lives that were largely miserable, brutish and short. The average life expectancy for most humans for most of history has been roughly 30 years or more. So it's only in the grand scheme of human history, relatively recent, that this line has started to come down. Now here we are, excuse me, in the early decades of the 21st century. If we believe Bob Fogel's story, this is the quarter, if you see it as a game, the fourth quarter of a big game in which either we will succeed in being able to eliminate global poverty from the world, and we will have all of these countries go through something like this fourfold transformation, or we won't. There is nothing guaranteed in history that says that those trends will continue. The 20th century was a violent and bloody century as most of today's rich countries became rich, as they went through their own version of those social transformations and political transformations and economic transformations. They've been violent pretty much everywhere they've happened. And it's a great credit to countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, for that matter, that those processes, for the most part, have not been violent. But pretty much everywhere else, they have been. And I think many of the challenges we see in the Middle East today are products of their own ongoing engagements with these very difficult transformational challenges. And where those don't happen, you create lots of unhappiness. And we see even individual countries that have gone backwards, countries like Venezuela, for example, countries that were one of the richest countries only a few decades ago, and now Venezuela, I think, is about the 80th or 90th richest countries in the world. So there is no inherent reason why we should be complacent, or any country should be complacent when it has reached a certain stage of development. There are things that can happen that can lead to that whole process unraveling, and unraveling quite quickly. So I think the challenge for everybody in this room, the challenge of our generation, the challenge of our children over the course of the 21st century will be ensuring that that line continues to drop, and that it all comes unglued. And what that will take, I think, is a concerted attempt to really focus on public administration. You might think that's a kind of a boring conclusion or an unsexy way to resolve some of these issues, but in the space of international relations, for example, all of these big challenges with migration that are occurring in Eastern Europe at the moment, those can't be solved by the policy responses of any one country. In a world in which everybody is interconnected with everybody else, we need very strong international systems, international law, to be able to address these kinds of challenges. But we're still very young as a world. We're only 60 years or 70 years in to a world in which we take international law seriously as a mechanism for resolving our disputes, for resolving our trade disagreements, for example, or resolving our wars, for that matter. Right? So these systems which humans have invented, and legal systems are systems like languages that humans have invented, these are systems that we need to keep working on all the time, because they have been invented by humans and they can be uninvented by humans. They can be lost, they can dissipate, they can unravel. And I think the key challenge for how we manage these transitions now in the 21st century is how we figure out, domestically and internationally, how to build up high capability institutions for doing these incrementally more complex and more contentious tasks. So that was the big picture over 4 centuries. If you look at it over an even longer time period, you can see that these kinds of transformations from a world historical perspective are just driving these huge inequalities between different parts of the world. I think that itself is a source of instability. So over the course of even just the last 50 years or so, we've seen these huge, big, widening transformations between countries in Western Europe and the United States, which are now continuing to go ahead, and countries like Syria and others that are seemingly forever going to be stuck at this bottom level. So this world of rapid divergence is a world that I think is very is one that potentially is very unstable. And the solution is not to shut down the growth, the engines that drive the prosperous economies, but is to have a much more serious engagement with the types of economic growth that we have, and making sure that that economic growth is as inclusive as possible for everybody and not just for those at the top. Even just one nerdy point, even if we have very modest growth in a very rich country, 2%, right? 2% is not spectacular growth. Malaysia is estimated to have 5% over the next year. So even if the poor countries grow at 2%, the basic mathematics of having a rich country grow at 2% and a poorer country grow at 7% still means that in absolute terms, the gap between those countries widens. So we have this widening out of the world. And this is true even when you look at OECD countries, the rich countries. So this graph shows economic growth since 1970, and you can see in 1970, most of the rich countries of the world themselves were more or less equal to each other. And even amongst the countries that have gone through much of that fourfold development transformation that I mentioned, even there you have these huge inequalities between countries and within countries as well occurring. Now, I mention this in part because I think that if we were trying to have particular targets and goals that we want to set for ourselves, and we take seriously this development as a fourfold transformational task, we need to worry about the economy, yes, but we also need to worry about these other four dimensions. And I'm going to use a country that I'm going to call Portugal as my example for talking about some of these things here. Why do I use Portugal? Portugal is probably the poorest country that's in the rich country club. It's the country that has been one of the founding members of the OECD back in the early 1960s. It is a country that, for all intents and purposes, has gone through that fourfold transformation, but it's roughly at about $25,000 per capita per year, even with the recent challenges associated with the global financial crisis. At $25,000 GDP per capita, again, the basic math on that suggests that it's about $100 a day. Right? I'm going to suggest, quite radically perhaps, that that is the target. We will be in a world in which we have successfully accomplished the fourfold transformation, roughly speaking, when a country can provide $100 a day for all of its citizens. Why do I say that, and why am I being a little provocative with that? I think because that's what it takes to fund public administrative systems that can provide equal protection and equal opportunity for all. And again, I will use Portugal as an example of that. Not Luxembourg, the country way up there at the top, the richest country in the world, but the country that has made it that far. Now, just as a way of comparison, Malaysia today is about where Portugal was roughly 20 years ago or so. So over the course of the professional life of most people in this room, I would suggest the next 20 years is this very big challenge to see, not just to get to the $15,000 a mark that I know is the big target here for Malaysia, but I think to get to a point where you have the public revenue that can, and the systems that can deliver for all citizens, it's going to be about a $25,000 a year target, which is even more ambitious, but I think that's what we need to be thinking of. And how do we do that in a way that's still environmentally sustainable? How do we do that in a way that doesn't keep these wedges, these widening inequalities from occurring? Again, all of those challenges require high quality public administrative systems to be able to deliver pensions for an increasingly old population, for example. Increasing sophistication of health services, because as people get older, as the society gets older, the very kinds of illnesses that its population suffers from change, and they become more expensive. All of these things just keep getting more expensive. And so we have to have very effective systems for implementing high quality public services if we're going to get there. Okay. Now, the good news out of all this, I think, is that Malaysia, for the first time last year, officially became above average in the rest of the world. It never has happened in the history of the world before. So, just a little bit, but it's there. Yay, that's great. So that's the good news. The sobering news, I think, is that there is still quite a long way to go to we'll get to this land we'll call Portugal. And even the 15,000 a year target is still going to be quite a challenge if the recent history is any guide. But I think in the particular space of macroeconomic management, for example, I think Malaysia's in very good hands. All the people that I deal with in the Ministry of Finance or in the central bank, the Bank Negara, all those people know what they're doing. They're very well trained. They have all the expertise that could possibly be available to them. The bigger challenge is not so much for me in this economic quadrant. The bigger challenges are in this public administration quadrant, of how we build the systems that can engage with these increasingly complicated and contentious tasks. So, as I mentioned, I think that we need to be always wary a little bit of just seeing GNP per capita as our single metric. It just happens to be correlated with a lot of the other things we care about in the world. It's very necessary and probably empirically is the primary driver of poverty reduction, and it's also the main way in which we can generate revenue for public goods provision. Since energy, schools, hospitals, clean air and water, providing all those things is just really hard and it's just really expensive. And you've got to have revenue to do that. And so it's crucial to have a strong and vibrant economy. But a strong economy is also very inefficient. As I mentioned, sound policies only get you so far. There are only so many things that you can manage by adjusting your inflation targets or your interest rates. That's really difficult work, and really smart people sit around on a nearly daily basis and try and figure those things out. But the really big challenges, I think, are elsewhere. Because an expanding economy, an economy that's going to get you to 15,000 and then to 25,000, is an economy that's going to be increasingly complex and an economy that's going to be increasingly integrated with the rest of the world. And so as much as your own domestic policies are going to be really crucial, much of what happens is going to be beyond any given country's control, which means we all have an interest in how each other governs these issues, and all of that comes back to the capability of our public administrative and international systems for being able to manage these particular challenges. The more complicated and more subtle point, but one that's actually a very central part of political and social theory, is that growth itself alters the social foundations on which growth occurs. Right? So if you look at whether it was Schumpeter and his ideas of the constant ways in which change was being generating from below, and you look at more recently Ruth Appleby's wonderful work on this idea of capitalism as generating relentless revolutions, constantly changing things. I think you see over the course of that 400-year period that I mentioned before, lots of examples of ways in which countries that, as they became richer, as they became, as new sources of wealth emerged in an economy, as new sources of power emerged in a society representing that wealth, those were many of the big drivers of the conflicts in the 20th century. So these processes of constant change, these processes that growth itself keeps on requiring and keeps on promoting, those have to be managed as well. And again, the only way to manage those successfully and inclusively and sustainably is having high quality public administrative systems. That's what we really need to be able to take on the tasks that just keep getting harder. Development doesn't stop. Even rich countries like the United States, where I happen to live right now, has enormous problems with its public school systems. Some of you may know Mark Zuckerberg. I'm sure many of you in the room are Facebook people. Mark Zuckerberg gave $100 million last year to one school district, 6 years ago, to one particular school district in New Jersey, thinking that if we just provided more money to that system, we would be able to change it and give kids from disadvantaged backgrounds a better opportunity. And a recent book laments just how difficult it actually really was. In fact, $100 million didn't really buy them much at all in terms of improving the capability of those systems to be able to deliver for many of the minority groups in the United States. So money isn't the issue. Money is nice. Money is necessary to have to fund this work. but it doesn't make you a good chef. By that I mean we can provide all the ingredients for these systems, and even sometimes foreign aid itself can try and provide some of those ingredients. But if you can't combine the ingredients, then you don't get a nice meal. And we're really good in the international development world of being able to provide inputs. We're very lousy at being able to tell or figure out how to combine all of those things. And that combining is as different as the food and the language of each country. How each country combines, takes the same ingredients and produces different food, produces different languages, produces different religions. All of those are things that humans have invented. And our public administrative systems are like that. They're things we have invented, and then we have to keep inventing and keep working on, because you can't just provide them from the outside, and you can't just throw money at them and expect that they will be solved. You have to have a whole different strategy for how you think about building the capability of these systems to deliver. They're amazing, actually, that electricity and air conditioning can be provided in a room like this, that we can drink clean water and eat clean food. All of that happens because of a vast array of legal and social norms that make it possible for all of these good things to happen. But those same kinds of things need to be not just in things that everybody wants, like schools and electricity. They have to be able to do hard things as well, like taxation, like regulating powerful companies, like being able to act as a countervailing force as necessary with powerful people in society. And that, I think, is where we have not, the international development organizations like the World Bank and many others, just don't have very good theories, we don't have very good strategies, and we don't have very good track records of being able to do that. We have good track records of providing you with stuff, or providing anybody with stuff. We have a very lousy record of being able to help people combine that into systems that can deliver for everybody. So here's the development dilemma then. I've told a world of happy stories in which indicators are improving, life expectancy is expanding, less children are dying when they're young. All of those are very laudable, notable, and celebratory achievements, things we, the world, should be very proud of. But if you look over the course of the last 60 years or so, it's much harder to see a story in which the capability of organizations has gone in lockstep with that. So we're left with a bit of a paradox. If the world is getting better, and if the world is improving, and yet the systems that we are relying on to do all of this seem, as best we can tell, to not be improving, how is this happening? Well, I think one of the reasons this happens is that we have stopped doing awful things to each other. By that I mean despite what we might see in the headlines, I think people like Steven Pinker and others have written very influential work showing that, in fact, the world is much less violent now than it has been for most of human history. We have instances of awful wars going on, but we don't have large-scale, massive atrocities that we had right up until the middle of the 1990s. So over the last 20 years or so, we the world have largely stopped doing awful things to each other, except in a few isolated particular country instances, which we won't go into. But seen in the big picture, I think if you just stop doing awful things to each other, the world can get better. I think we've done lots of good things with tasks that are reducible to logistics and technical reform. I think we've done great things with immunizing babies, for example. Right? Immunizing babies is a quintessential task that big bureaucracies are really good at. Why are they good at it? Because the technology is well understood. It requires only that a frontline health worker take a new baby and inject them with a particular inoculation or some form of disease-ridding agent. And you do that 100 times, 100 million times, 1 billion times, you will see amazing changes happen with indicators like infant mortality. If education is just about building schools and printing textbooks, then yes, you will see incredible improvements in the quality, at least in the accessibility of things like primary education. And again, mathematically, when you go from having no school to even having one school, that's an infinite improvement, right? So these are the big challenges and changes that have occurred over the last 20 years. I think we've stopped doing awful things and we've done many of the easy things, or the easier things. We've done the things that our administrative systems are already pretty good at. But there's only so much low-hanging fruit. That's a phrase we use a lot these days. And maybe having a few extra ladders can help you to climb up a little higher and get a few more of the next layer of low-hanging fruit. But the big challenge is to make systems that can functionally perform for everybody, that'll get us to this land of Portugal. That requires, I think, a very different way of thinking about what institutions are, what the reform process needed to get them working at a high level will look like, and then what every country can do to figure out its own strategy for combining, its own strategy for taking the ingredients but making them into something that they can own, something that feels like them, something that they're proud of and something that reflects their own values and their own culture. So this is the world that we live in. And I think we are not going to be able to sustain, I will suggest, many of these gains that we've already achieved up here unless we can do something quite fundamental about how we think about our organizational capability. So I've mentioned that, some of these already, but they bear repeating. Most of the Millennium Development Goals in most places have mostly been met. In really interesting little statistics like the fact that the average years spent in school in Bangladesh now is higher than it was in France in 1960. So 50 years ago, the average French citizen spent less time in school than today's Bangladeshi does. Right? But what's the difference? The obvious difference I hope you see is that the quality of education, not the quantity of education, was very, very different in those systems. So the big challenge for a country like Bangladesh, or a very poor country like Bangladesh, is not just to make sure that kids are in the school so they can meet a Millennium Development Target on access. The big challenge is how do you improve the quality and the capability of those systems to deliver for everyone and not just the privileged kids in the private schools. We've seen rapid reductions in the $2 a day poverty lines. We've seen the rapid declines of pandemics, and the recent Nobel Prize given to Angus Deaton shows very powerfully just how much of the improvements in health have occurred around the world. And life expectancy has gone from 30 to 60. So these are all big changes, all that occurred in that top part of the graph below. But let's just take a look at some of the big changes that have occurred, or not occurred, I should say, in the space of organizations, because this is the system, this is where these changes have been quite remarkable, or remarkable for the slowness with which they have occurred, or indeed, oftentimes, the backwardness with which they have occurred. Now, measuring institutions, or measuring the capability of organizations, is a new area for researchers. We're still trying to get a much better handle on how we do that. I'm going to present you 3 different examples of the kinds of ways in which we, the research community, have tried to engage with this. Some of it is by using big cross-national data sets that help us to be able to look at and compare the quality of institutions across countries. So I'll do that with my next slide. But then we'll also look at some experimental work that's been done trying to test out the capability of different systems around the world. And then we'll look at some anthropology as well, just to cover the full disciplinary base. We'll do some cross-national, some experimental, and some anthropology. And all of these different forms of evidence, these different ways of engaging with these problems, all point, I think, in a pretty similar direction. Namely, that the improvements that have occurred in the institutions, in the institutional space, has been pretty few and far between. Most countries are flatlining or, in fact, declining. And I think one of the reasons then this becomes that the frontier issue for development in the 21st century is that unless we can figure out, we, the world, we, Malaysia, we, every country, can figure out how to engage with that, then we're not going to be able to see the conclusion of that Robert Fogel graph, the conclusion of a world in which everybody lives a peaceful and prosperous life. So here's just one simple graph. This is maybe a little complicated. The easiest way to look at it is just to look at, see that what we've done here on the top is to look at the change in countries over a 10-year period, and on this left-hand side here to look at where they started from. And the green countries are the countries that were doing pretty well and have kept on improving. There's not too many of those. The yellow countries are the ones that are pretty much stagnant, and they haven't really gone anywhere. And the countries that are in the red are the ones that were not so great and now have also continued only to decline. And there are 98 different countries that one can do this kind of analysis on. And even just using very simple basic statistical methods, 68 of those countries in the world are either flatlining or declining. So nearly more than 2/3 of the countries in the world are not doing so great in the world of their institutions. Malaysia, you'll see, is right in the middle of that, a country that's got good institutions, but not great. And I hope that I think that one of the themes of this conference is, how do we make that transition from good to great? Well, that's really hard, and we'll come back to talking about some of that later on, about what we might do with that. But in that sort of categorization at least, and one doesn't necessarily need to take this too literally, but nonetheless, Malaysia is in the same category as countries like India and Pakistan. And you probably don't think that you're in that category, but at least that's, in terms of how the rest of the world measures these things, that's where it tends to be right now. But the broader point is, for everybody in the world, this is a really tough issue. It's not just the rich countries, not just the poorest countries. It's a challenge for everyone. We've done what we can do by plucking the low-hanging fruit. We've done what we can do by requiring logistical machines to be able to move in and solve the problems. The problems get more difficult once we move into the space where we have to combine, where we have to figure out how to put these different ingredients together for different ways, for different people in different places. Okay, so here's some other ways we can look at this. This is a country like Haiti, which, as you all know, I'm sure, is not the happiest place in the world. But here's where here's where Haiti was in 2008. And you can look at the various different trajectories about how long it will take just to get to the level of India if it continues to grow at its current pace of change that it's been on for the last 200 years. Haiti has been an independent country for 200 years. Haiti will get to be at India standards somewhere out in the corridor over there, like many centuries away. The unfortunate trend is, though, the last 10 years, a country like Haiti has only been getting worse. And if you're getting worse, it's going to take you forever. You'll never get where you want to go if your systems are declining. So, unfortunately, most of the time in the international development scene, we want countries to reform at the fastest pace of everybody. But even if a country like Haiti was to reform at the average level, it's still going to take probably 20 or 30 years for them to be able to get to a minimally functional kind of level. So the time horizons we're talking about across the world are measured in terms of decades. And I think that's the kind of time horizon that makes politicians very nervous. It makes people that preside over development projects very nervous because they want to be able to promise and deliver things in 3 or 5 year time frames. But the challenge of improving the capability of our public administrative systems is a decades-long task. It always has been. It took centuries for Western countries to be able to get the capability levels that their systems has. And we are expecting or hoping that many other countries can now do this in a period of 5 or 10 years. I think realistically, in terms of the evidence base that we have, these challenges are only going to be ones that occur over much longer time frames. Now, I mentioned that we can do this in different ways. That's a big, broad brushstrokes kind of way of looking at this. In the development research community over the last decade, there's been a real fascination with doing experiments or quasi-experiments, looking at different ways in which we can test out particular phenomena in very discrete kinds of ways. And so one of the ones I'm going to describe now is a test that was done to look at the easiest task that countries do anywhere in the world. And the easiest task that any country does is deliver the mail. And I'll talk about that in a bit longer. Then I'll go from there to anthropology in India. And I'll talk about an amazing program that was designed to try and help elderly women in that particular country. We'll look at where the capability challenge emerged and why it broke down and keeps breaking down so often in that particular country. So I talked about these big trends over decades, the big comparisons across time. Let's start looking at this one fascinating test that some of my colleagues in the economics department at Harvard did a few years ago. They conducted a very simple test, and the very simple test was, how effective are the post offices of different countries around the world? As it happens, there are 157 countries in the world that are signatories to an agreement that simply says, if you receive a misaddressed envelope, you will send it back to the country from whence it came. Period. 157 countries in the world have signed that agreement. That's about as non-controversial, non-complex, easy a task as can be done. And so what they did was to send out letters, 10 letters, misaddressed letters to all 157 countries, set their stopwatches and count how many days it took for these letters to come back. Very simple, very basic little test, right? And if we have any Czechs in the room, they can stand and get applause for having the best post office in the world. It delivered all 10 of those letters, misaddressed letters, came back. But for many of the other countries in the world, this most basic task, deeply non-controversial, nobody doesn't want their mail delivered, right? Everybody thinks the mail is necessary. Everybody wants to have the post guy show up every day and deliver your little envelope to you, right? It's not rocket science. It is not brain surgery. It is not public administration. I mean, it is public administration, but it's the easiest form of it, right? And even here in the countries up the top, not just the poorest countries, but countries you would think might actually have pretty good systems like Russia or Ghana or Nigeria, right? These are countries that even there, none of the envelopes came back. Right? Now, again, one doesn't have to take that sort of stuff too literally. Maybe they're really poor and they're financially strapped post offices and they think, well, we won't prioritize sending back envelopes, we'll just focus on doing what we have to do. But the point is, as a policy, it's identical across countries. Right? Every country has a policy, including Malaysia, of sending back misaddressed envelopes. The policy is identical, and yet the capability to actually deliver on that policy varies enormously. Right? So, one simple little thing that I think would be really interesting to try out, you can see where this is going, right, is to think, how can we do that kind of research in Malaysia? How can we send out little simple ways of finding out just how good these systems are? And how could we, and expect that there'd probably be a huge variation in the quality of that response? And how could we share the lessons from the ones that really did well with those that didn't do so well? Because I think that's how we learn complicated tasks. When we're learning a language, for example, a foreign language, right? When we learn it by practicing. We learn by not being very good initially, but then we get feedback and we try to improve on the basis of learning from those that have already figured out how to do this. Right? So we'll come back to this at the end of my presentation. This is one very simple little example of how you can do research to look at and just test out the capabilities of systems. One of the most famous books of the last century was Robert Putnam's Making Democracy Work, which some of you may have heard of. That particular book also employed an array of very different tests to look at variation within Italy about how long it took to start up a business. So they would send out a common letter to all of the business bureaus of all the districts around Italy and say, I would like to start a small business in your company. Can you please send me information on how I would do that? And then set the stopwatch, see how long it actually takes for different groups. Why are some people so much more responsive when in principle the policy is identical? Right? We'll come back to that, as I said, later on. So from big picture cross-national data sets to time series analysis to little experiments, let's go into anthropology. This is an even more fascinating one for me because it was a big project done and a very incredibly progressive project that was done, or policy initiative that was launched done by an Indian anthropologist called Akhil Gupta. And the book is called Red Tape. Wonderful title for a book on bureaucracies. But the book is all about a story about this particular development, this social program that was designed to try and help women who were over the age of 50 years old who had less than 3 children and less than 2 hectares of land. These are the poorest women of India, right? So it was a very progressive social policy. It was a very inclusive social policy. And the first part of the book is all about all the incredible work that was done by the policy advocates and by the NGOs who are really pushing hard for a long time for this particular policy to be articulated and then for it to be funded and then begin to be implemented. And it's very Kennedy School type reading, right? This is what the smart people did. This is all the analysis that they did. Here's how they figured out how they would have to get votes in the parliament in order to be able to get it through. It's a very nerdy kind of discussion about how policy works. And then the final 2/3 of the book is this big lament about what happened when they tried actually to implement this wonderfully progressive, wonderfully comprehensive and inclusive social program. And it turned out that even some of the most basic things were the reason this program came unglued. I'm pretty sure everybody in this room, if I asked you, could tell me not only how old you were, but how old you were to the nearest day. Right? Your passport or your driver's license or some other form of official documentation would enable you to be able to tell exactly how old you were to the day. And so there wouldn't have to be a discussion about whether you were over 40, over 50 or under 50 and thus eligible for this particular program. In this particular instance though, the whole program came unglued because even something as basic as being able to measure people's ages in some parts of India turned out to be impossible. Because in the most rural parts of India, people don't measure their age in years. They don't even celebrate birthdays. They don't have any way of being able to mark how old they are in the way that everybody in this room does. And so, in effect, you became as old as the frontline official said you were, right? I will say that you are 52, and I will then expect some favors back from you. And the book gets very angry at the ways in which then this criteria, which should be objective, which should be easily understood by everybody, gets used as a weapon for being able to discriminate against women. Because some of them will say that they are 48 and some will say that they are 52, and then the enemies that will yell out and challenge them and say, she's not really 52, she's only 48. So it becomes this whole scene of contestation, even at the local village level, because the basic instruments for delivering are not there. Same thing with how many children you have or how much land you own. All of those actually require amazingly sophisticated public administrative systems in basic stuff, right? Like how many children you have, how much land you own, how old you are, right? Even in those particular spaces, there's this big gap between the things we can design and yet the big gap between what we design and how well we can implement. Let alone the very hardest tasks of all, like giving women the vote, ending slavery, ending colonialism, expanding. So these are the really, really hard tasks, but yet the ones that we're most celebrating in human history. Now, one of the ways in which the international development community, I think, is complicit in this is so often that we engage in processes of reform that don't end up actually changing those systems. We engage in processes of reform that end up changing what they look like rather than what they actually do. So here is a courthouse in a country in the Pacific Islands, a country where the problem was deemed to be the absence of a high-quality justice system. And so my country delivered and provided a wonderful set of institutions that made it look like it had a highly effective justice system. It built this wonderful courthouse here, for example, that cost about $40 million or so to build. There was no corruption associated with this. These fine gentlemen across the front were all local workers that built this. It was all the wood that was used to make this all came from locally sourced timber, so it was eco-friendly. It had no air conditioning system because it had been designed just so that it would capture the sea breezes coming off, so that it didn't need to have a high carbon footprint. Everything you would want to have happen back in a capital city in a rich country to make it look like an effective justice system happened here. There's no horrible story about money being stolen or laundered or people running off and doing awful things. This didn't raise any hackles anywhere, precisely because it was able to provide what so often we count as success when it really wasn't. And so what would a different strategy for building the justice system look like? One that doesn't just build the veneer, doesn't just build a system that looks like a state, but that build ones that actually functions and responds to the concerns of everyday citizens. And in the work that was mentioned in the introduction through our Justice for the Poor program, we engaged in a whole series of initiatives to try and look at what building the capability of the justice system from below might look like. Or in a neighboring country here in Cambodia, a fascinating experience with building an arbitration council, which took 10 years, but which is now one of the most amazing and successful institutions for solving conflicts around labor in any developing country in the world. So let's get back here to looking at the capability of education, because I think that's a really important issue, and one that I will be working on here during my time in Malaysia. I mentioned that I think sort of Portugal in the abstract is a goal to which we should be aspiring. Well, countries that have gone through that fourfold transformation that I mentioned largely deliver on these international tests that we have of education capability, learning goals, combining goals, not just ingredients goals, at about the 480 level. Right? So 480 is about the kind of level that you need to be at, I think, to be able to produce a steady supply of highly educated workers who can compete and engage in the rest of the global economy. As I'm sure you know, and as the Minister of Education himself has been himself been concerned about, Malaysia is still quite some distance from that. Still about 420, the same level roughly as Mexico and Chile with regards to the capability of its education system. That's actually about what you would expect for a country roughly at the GNP per capita level. So I don't think there should be too much unnecessary hand-wringing over that, given where Malaysia is at. But I think in terms of the ambition, in terms of the commitments that Malaysia is making and wants to continue making to its overall population, you've got a big trajectory, a big gap to catch up there of about 60 points. Now, individual schools might be able to do that, but for a system, a public administrative system, to be able to do that at scale, that is the big challenge. And oftentimes, I think you're going to get much help from the rest of the world about how to do that. Too much of the time will be spent building the equivalent of those nice courthouses that I showed you before. Systems that will look like they can function and will look like what the systems look like in rich countries, but that won't be able to function that way. And that's what we really need to do. So let me conclude by giving you a practical example of how we've tried to respond to some of these challenges and some of the ways in which we can use evidence to try and make that happen. I did a big study earlier this year, after 2 years or more of work, looking at exactly these questions in the Middle East. Now, you might think that, well, the lessons from the Middle East don't apply here. I'm going to try and argue that they do, largely because, as I said with the United States even, there's this always huge variation in the capability of systems to respond to complex tasks. They always generate high variation. The challenge is what we do in response to that. So we did this big 300-page book on the ways in which we can try and improve the capability of the systems for delivering public services in the Middle East. And you don't need me to tell you just how important it is that we get that right in the Middle East, given the turmoil and the conflict that is always going on there. So the standard way in which you would write a report like this is to do something similar almost to what I've just done before, is to look at the different ways in which different countries line up, and you say, oh, Yemen's here and Morocco's there and Egypt's there, so maybe something should happen from Morocco should learn from Yemen, or there should be some kind of exchange and we can try and learn from that. Yes, maybe that's true. But what we did with this report was to really try and say, look, the best lessons for any country are the lessons from itself. The lessons, the best way to improve your system is not so much to look outside, though that may happen. If you want to move the whole system, you've got to really work domestically. You've got to try and learn from the array of and failures that are occurring within your own country. And that requires a revolution in the openness and the quality and the comprehensiveness of data. So we did the best as we could with the data we had available to us. This is just one example from Yemen. Now, Yemen obviously isn't Malaysia, but Yemen, for present purposes, is wonderful for showing an extraordinary variation given a consistent policy. Okay? So here we have absenteeism in health clinics in Yemen. Yemen's a very centralized country, so every health worker in that country is operating under exactly the same policy. They're getting paid the same amount. They're following exactly the same rules. Right? There isn't a policy problem in Yemen. There is a huge implementation problem. Right? It ranges from 8 down to 83 with respect to the variation. I would love, love, love to see graphs like this, equivalently as micro level as you can get, using like a Google Earth kind of map for the quality of education and the ways in which all different kinds of public services are being portrayed here and delivered here in Malaysia. That would be both very transparent, but an enormous resource for being able to learn and to be able to improve the capability of those systems. And you might think, well, maybe these places where absenteeism is really high, where in a place like Abhar here, for example, where 70% of the people are not showing up for work every day. Maybe they're just all not working so well. Maybe they're just a really difficult place and it's really not going so well. Well, here, this looks at just the number of beds per facility, right? The resource intensiveness of the quality of these services. Abhar, you'll see here, is the top performer, right? So it has nobody showing up, has lots of people not showing up for work, and yet it actually has really quite well-resourced forms of public services being available to it. And in fact, if you do this, here's my second little nerdy, geeky moment. If you actually do a simple correlation between these different kinds of problems to do with absenteeism, to do with the presence of drugs that are available to patients, essentially zero correlation, which means all these problems are happening in their own way, in their own places. There's no silver bullet solution you can apply to those particular problems because they all have their own problems in their own way in each place. That's why they're really hard. That's why you can't have smart people in Kuala Lumpur design the solution to these things, because there isn't a solution to these things. There are solutions, plural. Right? And we've got to have systems in place that can help us to be able to identify how that problem is different to that problem, is different to that problem, is different to that problem, is different to that problem. Right? And that requires, I think, a really strong investment in data. Now, I say that because I'm a researcher. I have a vested interest in calling for more research being done. That's what we always do in this business. But in this particular report, I think we've been able to show empirically that the complexity of these tasks inherently generates this big variation. But what we really want to be able to do now is to be able to learn from that variation, not blame people necessarily. We want to show that what is it about these particular places that means that down the road, 83% of people don't show up for work, but up here, only 8% don't show up for work. Why? What's going on? What are they doing? I don't know. I have no way of knowing what that is. People who are working there do. Their bosses probably have a fairly good idea. They should be sharing their lessons with other people elsewhere about trying to learn how those reform processes can occur. So it's not about building systems that look nice from the outside, like that jail and that courthouse that I showed you before. We've done that for decades. It really, really doesn't work. You can't make something look like something and expect it to function like something. What you can do is invest much more in the systems and the learning capabilities of those systems to be able to solve incrementally more complex and contentious tasks. The bar is low. We can't even solve many of our post office problems, as I saw before. And at the big picture level, the trend lines are all very flat. And they're flat in part because I think the international development community has not had a very good strategy for engaging with these problems. But the challenge here in Malaysia is enormous, and the opportunity is correspondingly enormous because conferences like this say that there is a huge amount of interest in doing this, and the strong role that universities play in this process can be a crucial way in which we can develop the capability, our research capability, to be able to document, to be able to share, explain, and learn from all of those different sources of variation. That, I suggest, is how we can move this frontier in the 21st century forward, by having a much richer engagement with these things. So that's some of the source material. Researchers write papers, so the stuff's available. I'll make a particular concluding plug for the bottom website there. We, with colleagues Lant Pritchard and Matt Andrews at the Kennedy School, we now have an online course that we've set up to engage the whole development community for free around this. So if you, or particularly your staff, are interested in learning more about this kind of approach to thinking about capability enhancement, we can offer a free class that you can take online through the Kennedy School. And I look forward to getting your feedback as we ourselves try and improve that system going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. We do have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. Can we do a bit of an exercise? I like to, play around with Perak-based people. Anyone here can raise their hand if they are from the public sector? No public sector? Yes. Did I hear public sector? Yes. All the things that Michael has said points to the challenges of the public sector professionals, administrators, because it's about public service delivery. He gave us first the good news of the low-hanging fruits, and then he made us realize that, hey, there's a lot more to climb and to go to the top, and it's not that easy. But best of all, he ended up by saying that he's giving free information and training online. So please ask him. There's a range of questions that you can ask.
I was in the corporate division, planning division of Lembaga Electric Negara 25 years ago.
Good.
And we were the beneficiaries of World Bank. But I think since Malaysia became the category of less developed, so-called newly developed countries, we were no more qualified as a World Bank recipient for loans, especially to build bigger power plants. But as a corporate division officer, we were very wary of World Bank officers also, because just because we were beneficiaries or recipients of World Bank, we have to open up everything. We have to open up our 20-year plans, our strategic plans to them, and we as corporate officers, being a Malaysian citizen, we are very, very wary of that, especially government servants. So when Malaysia departed or sort of they're not anymore qualified as a World Bank recipient, we were very, very glad, because now we are more independent in our planning process. We are more able to plan our future independently. And how do you see this as a World Bank crisis with developing countries who try to safeguard their sovereignty, especially government servants who are very jealous of their own sovereignty? Thank you very much.
I think Malaysian government has shown incredible foresight by asking the World Bank to be here in the particular capacity that it is. I mentioned at the beginning that this is the World Bank's first ever knowledge and research hub. And we've had knowledge hubs before, in Korea, for example, but we've never had a knowledge and research hub. So there will be no loans that will be taken or given between the World Bank and Malaysia. There will be particular kinds of services, particular niche issues perhaps on which the Malaysian government would like assistance. But at least the people that I've spoken to, and certainly with Pemandu and with the groups that have a responsibility for trying to really improve the quality of implementation here in Malaysia, it's the research component that they really want to focus on. And so my job and my colleagues' job over the next 5 years is really to figure out how we can make Malaysia special and how we can use this experience from Malaysia as a way of reimagining the World Bank in the future. I think if you look 20 years down the line, right, more countries are going to look like Malaysia. More countries are going to be middle-income countries. They're going to be at the place where they've largely solved most of their large-scale poverty problems. They'll have the basic ingredients there, as I mentioned before, but they'll all be confronting this combining problem. How do we put it all together? How do we make these systems, these complicated, contentious systems, work for everybody? So this is a whole new experience for the World Bank. I've been arguing for this, as you probably can tell, for a long time. And it's an incredible opportunity that's been given to try and work in a country where they take this seriously, where this issue of incorporating research into the real-time change process can be taken seriously. And I think, as I said, if you look at the next 20 years, Malaysia is going to be seen as the country that pioneered a very different way of having engagements with the international financial institutions, not as lending and borrowing money, but as ways of helping to build the capabilities of their systems. But that requires a revolution at the World Bank as much as it requires change here in Malaysia.